The most destructive weapon currently deployed in the Middle East is not a ballistic missile or a stealth bomber. It is a simple ticking clock. Right now, the United States Navy has effectively taken control of the Persian Gulf, intercepting vessels and heavily blockading Iranian ports following a critical maritime blunder. The American president has issued a massive military ultimatum over nuclear weapons, while Tehran dismisses the threat as a vain hope. In this standoff, the ultimate winners are global energy competitors, while the losers are the nations trapped in the crossfire. But the most revealing moment of this entire crisis is a sudden, unexpected silence. Why did the world's most powerful military abruptly pause a massive, planned offensive simply because its regional allies asked for 72 hours? To understand this pause, we must examine the global maritime chokepoint economy. The modern world relies heavily on the uninterrupted flow of goods and energy through very narrow corridors of water. The Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz represent the central artery of global petroleum logistics. When superpowers engage in conflict here, they do not merely fight over territory, they fight over the global supply chain. This system exists because naval dominance allows a superpower to project immense economic pain without necessarily firing a shot. A naval blockade is essentially the weaponization of the ocean. It physically prevents a targeted nation from participating in the global economy, turning ships into economic barriers. By sealing off ports, an attacking force starves the target's financial lifeblood. It forces the isolated government to make an impossible choice between total economic collapse and absolute political surrender. The current maritime crisis was triggered by a rapid escalation in naval aggression. Tensions in the Strait of Hormuz reached a breaking point following reported incidents involving Iranian vessels. In a highly volatile environment, Iranian ships reportedly refused to stand down during encounters with international maritime forces. This miscalculation, or blunder, provided the immediate justification for a massive retaliation. The United States Navy and Marine Corps moved aggressively to intercept these vessels, transitioning from a monitoring role to an active containment strategy. Washington subsequently initiated a heavy blockade of Iranian ports. The economic incentives driving this clash are stark. Iran, already facing severe financial isolation, utilizes small vessel harassment to signal that if it cannot freely export its oil, no one else in the region will operate securely either. The United States, conversely, must demonstrate absolute naval supremacy to reassure global markets and enforce its political demands. The mechanics of this specific standoff operate on three converging tracks: the physical blockade, the absolute ultimatum, and the Allied intervention. First, the physical blockade operates through overwhelming naval presence. Warships do not need to sink every commercial vessel approaching an Iranian port to be effective. They simply need to make the journey uninsurable. By intercepting a few ships and holding positions near key maritime approaches, the Navy signals to global shipping conglomerates that the ports are effectively closed. The insurance underwriters immediately revoke coverage, practically paralyzing maritime trade without a shot being fired. The second track is the political ultimatum. President Trump declared from the White House and on social media that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. He attached a highly specific threat to this declaration. If no agreement is reached swiftly, the United States will launch massive military strikes. This shifts the mechanism from a slow economic strangulation to the threat of imminent kinetic war. The third track is the diplomatic pause, which fundamentally alters the mechanism of the conflict. Gulf allies requested a brief window of 2 to 3 days before the strikes commenced. As a result, the planned offensive was put on standby, leaving military commanders awaiting further directives. This pause acts as an emergency pressure release valve. It is not driven by mercy, but by the complex economic vulnerability of the allies who requested it. The economic consequences of this naval standoff and the ticking clock are profound and immediate. The primary winners in the short term are alternative energy producers and financial speculators. Any threat to the Strait of Hormuz causes crude oil prices to spike, instantly enriching nations completely removed from the conflict. The clear losers are ordinary citizens globally, who absorb these geopolitical shocks through immediate inflation at the gas pump and increased costs for transported goods. For governments in the region, the impact is terrifyingly localized. The Gulf allies who requested the diplomatic pause are deeply integrated into the global economy. Their vast wealth depends entirely on their physical infrastructure. If the United States launches massive military strikes, Tehran has made it clear it will not surrender. Instead, Iran would likely retaliate asymmetrically, targeting the oil refineries, shipping terminals, and desalination plants of nearby American allies. The Gulf states requested the pause because they understand an American strike will burn their own economies to the ground. For corporations, particularly global shipping and insurance conglomerates, this environment is toxic. A blockade accompanied by the threat of massive strikes renders long-term logistical planning impossible. Ships are anchored at sea, burning fuel and losing money, waiting to see if a war will break out when the 72-hour window expires. The long-term effect is a permanent risk premium attached to the entire region, driving up the baseline cost of global trade regardless of how this specific crisis resolves. A common misunderstanding surrounds the nature of diplomatic deadlines and military ultimatums. The general public often views an ultimatum as a straightforward test of strength. Either the target surrenders or the missiles fly. People naturally assume that the 72-hour pause is merely the United States demonstrating patience and restraint before an inevitable, devastating attack. What most people get wrong is the assumption that the target state views the deadline the same way. Iranian officials have publicly dismissed the ultimatums, calling the deadlines a vain hope, and stating unequivocally that they will not surrender to political or military pressure. This is not mere rhetorical defiance, it is a calculated assessment of the alliance facing them. Tehran understands that the 72-hour pause was not an American idea. It was begged for by Gulf nations terrified of the fallout. The delay exposes a fracture in the coalition. Iran dismisses the deadline because they recognize that the United States' own allies are desperately trying to stop the war from happening. Moving forward, this structure forces three realistic outcomes based entirely on how the ticking clock expires. The first scenario is the expiration of the pause, resulting in massive strikes. The brief window closes without a back-channel diplomatic breakthrough. The United States follows through on the ultimatum, launching strikes against Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure. In response, Iran leverages its asymmetric naval capabilities to officially mine or close the Strait of Hormuz. The blockade turns into a full-blown maritime war, triggering a massive disruption in global energy markets, and likely plunging the world economy into a severe recession. The second scenario involves a coerced diplomatic off-ramp. During the 72-hour standby, the terrified Gulf allies managed to broker a quiet, intermediary deal. To protect their own infrastructure, they convince Washington to maintain the naval blockade, but step back from the kinetic military strikes. In exchange, Tehran agrees to a temporary, unpublicized freeze on specific nuclear enrichment activities. The immediate war is averted, but the heavy blockade remains, slowly suffocating the isolated economy without triggering a regional explosion. The third scenario is the normalization of the siege. The deadline passes, but the massive strikes are continually delayed under the guise of ongoing Allied consultations. Instead of a sudden war, the United States Navy and Marine Corps maintain their absolute dominance over the Gulf, intercepting vessels and enforcing the port blockade indefinitely. The region settles into a highly militarized permanent standoff, where the global economy simply absorbs the cost of navigating around a permanently blockaded nation. The current crisis in the Persian Gulf reveals a brutal truth about modern geopolitics. Power is not just the ability to launch massive strikes, it is the ability to absorb the consequences. The United States Navy can blockade ports and intercept ships with unparalleled efficiency. But the sudden, 72-hour pause exposes the fragility of the broader strategy. The nations geographically closest to the conflict are the ones who will pay the ultimate price if deterrence fails. As the clock ticks down and the ultimatum looms, the standoff is no longer just about nuclear weapons or naval supremacy. It is about economic survival. When the world's most powerful military has to pause an attack to protect the economies of its own allies, who is actually trapped by the blockade?